African mobile telecoms have seen massive growth in the last decade, with compound annual growth rate subscriptions up by 42%. Mark Casey, leader of technology, media and telecoms industry at Deloitte, and Aaron Babu, who is TMT leader for the firm's consulting practice, join us now for more. Mark, my impression of Africa is that the mobile telecommunications, the gadgets, the coverage, what they're using these things for is growing swiftly. They've bypassed a lot of traditional technologies. It's almost like there's an overdose. Are there unintended consequences coming? Do people really understand this market?
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting us on the show. There is an overdose, but the demand is still so significant that we don't see this this overdose having any negative consequence in the short term. Maybe just as a way of putting this in context, if you look at what's happened in Africa, we've got a middle class, and I know it was referred to in the last discussion, but a middle class growth that's been spectacular between 2000 and 2020, there'll be almost 250 million people on the continent becoming middle class, really important from a consumption standpoint. You've got bandwidth explosion at estimated to be 85% compounded annual growth in the first 6-7 years of the decade and set to continue. Connectivity rates also dramatically increasing. There's been lots of media coverage about the analog to digital conversion and the digital dividend by the release of precious spectrum. So opportunities are still absolutely enormous. However, for telcos, there's a whole other bunch of issues. So a maturing subscriber rate, growth in subscriber rates. You've got ARPU levels and margins starting to fall, voice being commoditized. So they're at a crossroads right now, and we just see a consolidation play like seen nowhere else in the world on our continent right now.
I'd like to bring you in here because one of the graphs that you have in your report that we'll pull up shortly is a differentiation conundrum that you make mention of, and that I take it applies to the telecoms companies in the market. Explain that for us.
Absolutely. I mean, the dichotomy that the telco operators are facing is sort of having to be an efficient, lean business while still looking for new revenue streams that they previously hadn't access to. This is things like mobile money, going into financial services, e-education, things that they never previously did.
Perhaps just tell us, it's on the screen at the moment. The writing is small, but what's the gist of it?
So the middle class is going to be giving them a traditional growth area of probably 100 million people over the next decade. But the margins are continuously going to be brought down, and telcos will have to find new revenue streams to actually increase their margins. And this is going away from the traditional revenue streams of data and SMS and voice to actually creating media offerings, e-health, e-education, and ICT sector. And that's an entirely different ball game for the telco operators going forward. Explain that a little bit further. Sorry, you wanted to interject, Mark?
Yeah, the dynamic is really interesting here in Africa. We've seen this in almost no other sector of the world. The consolidation of telcos, in other words, trying to grow into all those data plays, is not exclusively in the domain of telcos. So telcos we're seeing as targets in some parts of the continent, targets not by telcos but by media houses, by even advertising agencies who see a telco and their consumer base as the pipe or the vehicle to get their advertising products and service offerings to the growing middle class consumer base. So we're about to see a consolidation that's never been seen anywhere else in the world, right here in Africa.
Does that make sense? Because we know that Vodacom is on the prowl to gather data, Tata Communications. We also know that they're looking to have a merger perhaps with Naspers in order to make use of their media platforms. Is this the beginning of the change ultimately?
I mean, telco is going to be a glue of bringing industries together, whether it is actually financial services with telcos, whether it is education, access to mass media. Telco is going to be the glue that brings industries together. In the future, there's going to be more machines that are connected to the internet than human beings. And telco is going to be at the center of it. And if you look 10 years ahead, our fridges, our TVs, every single device that we interact with is going to be connected to the internet. And that's the opportunity and the threat the telco faces, because each of the other industries are trying to play in the telco space, and telco will want to play in their space. And that's the interesting phase we are currently going through.
Mark, what about governments in this? Because governments traditionally are slow to react. They're big beasts. They have other things on their mind, and when they look again, there's a whole industry that's appeared that hasn't been regulated, and very difficult to regulate once it's sprung up and is operating. That's happened in South Africa with television, with DSTV. It's happened with the taxi industry we talked about. It's happening now with phones. I mean, is this a monster in possibly a good way, possibly a bad way, the governments actually won't be able to do anything about?
Well, it's probably one of the fastest growing service lines that we've got is regulatory advice in the telecoms and media space. And governments are waking up to, hang on, is there a trick we're missing here? Are there some revenue streams that we're not
That's their main
into?
question. Is there tax to be had here?
And the licenses that we've issued, are they too simple? Can we actually subdivide them? Can we actually create licenses and revenue streams for instance, parts of the data game that we haven't locked into? What about our taxes? Are we really optimizing our tax take? And let me tell you, this is a constant debate.
But it's also politics, isn't it? I mean, the Arab Spring, we heard about the new role of social media there. China, very worried about its control of its billion people. So that's the other issue, Aaron.
It's always going to be a fine balance. Regulators trying to provide a free market for a thriving economy and having to keep a tight control over collection of revenue, having to balance security of the state. And it's always going to be that fine balance between multiple interests that the regulator have to keep together.
Are we ready for this, Mark? We touched on the regulatory issues, but what about infrastructure?
Ultimately, the consumers are ready for this. And that is actually driving the rollout of infrastructure. It's also driving the consolidation of infrastructure. So like tower deals, outsourcing by telcos, trying to get their cost base down, consolidating with other mobile network operators to use common platforms. That has been driven by the investors themselves. And governments also can understand that ultimately if they want to satisfy the demands of their people, and that's an important political manifesto, they've also got to chip in. Doesn't mean it's always going to be easy, but infrastructure is a huge initiative right now. And it's not just replacement of infrastructure for the existing 3G environments, but it's obviously looking forward towards 4G and LTE as well, especially with the analog to digital conversion and the release of the digital dividend.
Aaron, are there people investing in other things like schools, classrooms, which in 5 years' time you say, why did you do that? Couldn't you see what was coming, how technology could help you? You shouldn't have built these things.
You're totally right. Africa will transcend many technology evolution cycles that you typically see in the first world countries. We're going to go straight from not having something to having the best of the world overnight. And I don't think we're quite understanding that pace of that evolution. Soon you're going to see investments being made in traditional education that should perhaps have been done in e-education. And the governments are currently starting to move in this space, but not fast enough.